Good morning, everyone. This is a short video to remind you of what relative clauses are and to explain how to do today's activity attached in the separate Google Doc. Before we can get stuck into relative clauses, we need to remind ourselves of complex sentences, because as we'll see, relative clauses form a part of complex sentences. We know that there are two clauses in complex sentences: a main clause joined to a subordinate clause with a subordinating conjunction. So remember your I saw a WABUB acronym for those conjunctions. We know that the complex sentence can have the main clause at the beginning and the subordinate clause at the end, but it could also be flipped around with the subordinating conjunction at the start, leading the subordinate clause, comma, and then the main clause. Sentences with relative clauses are slightly different. They won't follow this format, but they will follow this format. So a relative clause is just a particular type of subordinate clause that does not begin with one of these conjunctions. It begins with a relative pronoun. So let's have a look at what a relative clause is. It basically adds more information about a noun in a main clause. For example, I go swimming at 5:30 a.m. On its own, that's a simple sentence. Swimming is the noun. At 5:30 a.m. is a prepositional phrase. So we can add, I go swimming at 5:30 a.m., which means I don't have breakfast until 8:30 a.m. So that second part, after which, is a subordinate clause, but it's a relative clause because it begins with a relative pronoun, the word which. There are three other words that will start a relative clause. They are who, which, whose, and that. This is what a relative clause sentence looks like. Generally, it is a main clause plus a relative pronoun, so one of those four relative pronouns, and then the subordinate clause. So again, I go swimming at 5:30 a.m., which means I don't have breakfast until 8 p.m. or 8 a.m. Have a look at a few more examples now, because there are also particular types of relative clauses called embedded relative clauses, and that just means that the relative clause is in the middle of a sentence and it's punctuated by commas. So a comma before the relative clause starts and a comma after it. Here's an example. My aunt, comma, whose name is Bethany, comma, is 4 years older than my mother. The relative clause beginning with whose is in the middle of the main clause. Second one, I walk to the park, comma, which is approximately half a kilometer away from my house, comma, during my lunch break in order to get some exercise. Again, the relative clause is in the middle. It begins with the word which, and it's in the middle of the main clause. Here's a picture of it as well. So an embedded relative clause will have part one of the main clause, the relative clause in the middle, and then part two of the same main clause. Here's the example from before. My aunt, whose name is Bethany, is 4 years older than my mother. If we break that up just into the main clause, my aunt is 4 years older than my mother. That is a main clause on its own. And then the relative clause, whose name is Bethany, we insert in the middle of that main clause. And the clause whose name is Bethany, it's a relative clause, but it cannot stand on its own, so it's a subordinate clause. It needs the help of a main clause to make sense. Your exercise for today will look like this. So at the top of your Google Doc page, you will have the reminder of what a relative clause is, the first sentence, and the four pronouns that you need to remember to use. The first exercise will ask you to fill in the three sentences by putting in the correct relative pronoun. Then you will have to write 3 sentences of your own, or 4 sentences rather, one for each of the pronouns. The third exercise will look at the embedded relative clauses. So you will have 3 sentences that you need to complete. So you'll have to write in your own relative clause for it to make sense. And then the fourth exercise is for you to write 3 sentences of your own that include an embedded